Greetings. I am Dr. Corey Miller, President and CEO of Ratio Christi Campus Apologetics Alliance. We are on 150 university campuses. Our vision is thoughtful Christianity transforming lives on campus today, changing culture tomorrow. On this episode of Thoughtful Christianity, we focus on faith and politics. My guest is Dr. Wayne Grudem. In academic parlance, we like to say he's got a paradox. That is, he doesn't merely have one doctorate, but a pair of doctorates. He is research professor of theology and biblical studies at Phoenix Seminary in Arizona. He did his undergraduate work at Harvard and then went on to Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia to do his Master's of Divinity and Doctorate of Divinity. And then he graduated from the University of Cambridge with his PhD. He served as the president of the Evangelical Theological Society. He was the general editor for the English Standard Version of the Study Bible and an editor of the 1,000-page tome, Theistic Evolution, a scientific, philosophical, and theological critique. He has a well-used 1,300-page systematic theology textbook selling over 500,000 copies, which has a sequel as well. Which I used as an undergrad and assigned to my students when I taught theology before moving on to philosophy years later. He's written more than 20 books, including some other large tomes, including a nearly 700-page book on politics according to the Bible, and co-edited along with John Piper, Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, again, nearly 600 pages. Those are just a couple of his big tomes. Perhaps the most controversial were some of his online writings defending his vote for President Donald J. Trump. Dr. Grudem, you have been busy. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Corey. Good to be with you.
So I wanted to jump right in on that last part, since we're off of the election now. We don't have as much of the media controversy, but nonetheless, there is still a tremendous amount of fallout. There's a tremendous amount of anger. Some within the Christian world about why someone from a Christian standpoint might vote for someone like President Trump, because we like to say that character matters. And I think you would agree with that. So if so, why would Christians, including yourself, advocate voting for someone whose character never trumped conservatives consider near anathema? Doesn't that destroy the Christian witness?
Well, character matters, certainly, Corey, but policies also matter. Policies make a huge difference. And I think in the election with Donald Trump, both times he ran, the question was he supportive of policies that are consistent with biblical teachings and biblical moral standards, and certainly protecting the lives of unborn children, appointing judges who would rule according to the wording of the law rather than according to their own preferences, strengthening our military, strengthening our border, providing more incentives for school choice, historic tax cuts and deregulation, which led to a tremendous economic boom, spearheading the development of a vaccine for COVID-19, which was approved in record time, developed and approved for use in record time, historic first. Many other things, religious freedom. I mean, building a border wall. There are many, many things that were policies that I clearly agreed with, and he kept his word on those policies after he was elected in 2016. Again and again, he kept his word and fulfilled many of his campaign promises. It's that, or choose a Democratic candidate who's pro-abortion, pro-LGBT, not just rights, but special treatment, and government forcing Christians against their conscience to endorse the legitimacy of abortion rights and same-sex marriage rights, curtailing American energy production through canceling the opposing of pipelines and oil drilling, higher taxes, crippling the economy, adding inflation. It didn't seem to me there was should be any confusion about the policies that differed between the two candidates and between the two parties. So it was because of Christian values that seemed to me to be evident from the teachings of the Bible that I thought the policies supported by President Trump were far better than those supported by the current president we have now, Joe Biden.
Yeah, and I can say, that while Ratio Christi is not a political entity, we do apologetics evangelism on campuses, but we appreciate all the freedoms that come along with that. We require the ability to have a platform on campus. I mean, we have been engaged in 30 plus cases of legal proceedings, 2 federal victories, a
Really?
contribution to a recent Supreme Court victory, and right now we're tied up with one involving the Biden administration's Department of Education. And I can say categorically that I think a lot of the confidence on the legal side was because of many of those judges that were being appointed that gave hope that, wow, we could actually be free and have a platform to debate on campuses and do it winsomely, but only if that debate is allowable. And it seems like in this culture, even the very freedom, it's not just about, free speech, but cognitive liberty, free thought. If you think the wrong thing, then you can get kicked off the campuses. And we know that the campus is where the fight is at.
Right.
So, when we think about things like religion and politics, those are the evil twins that one should never discuss, some say. 2 things you never want to discuss at a dinner table with a family member or a friend if you want to keep friends and influence people.
And I've written books on both of them.
Yeah. So why would you disagree that you shouldn't discuss those things? I mean, don't you want to keep friends and keep family members? How can we engage in these things without stepping in it?
Well, I think we should admit that we learn through interaction and conversation with others, those with whom we disagree, because they can point out new facts that we weren't aware of or reasoning that was inconsistent, but we can point out their inconsistencies as well. And so the American founders incorporated freedom of speech in the First Amendment to the Constitution, First Amendment in the Bill of Rights, because it's essential to a healthy democracy that we be able to discuss things calmly, civilly, reasonably. It's consistent with biblical teaching. The book of James says the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits. Right. The harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. And so that means that we shouldn't lose our temper and begin to use ad hominem arguments, attacking the character of the person that we disagree with, etc. I haven't seen that conviction played out in many of the people on the left, where there's an attempt to close down discussion. And I mean, these cases where a Christian baker is, where the law is attempting to force him to make a cake celebrating a same-sex marriage that he thinks is morally wrong, to force him by force of law to violate his conscience or drive him out of business. That's a very chilling incident, and it's been pushed. The attempt to compel approval of same-sex marriage is an attempt to compel people to affirm things they don't believe in and violate their deepest religious convictions, but that's coming from the political left. And it's worrisome. I don't think we should support that kind of agenda. So Christians should influence government for good. I don't know, Corey, if you have want to allow time for this, but I looked through the Old Testament first and then the New Testament to see if there were examples of God's people influencing secular governments for good, not the government of Israel, which was a theocracy, but the governments of other nations. And it starts way back in Genesis 41 with Joseph being second in command over the nation of Egypt, answering only to Pharaoh. And then we go forward to Esther. Esther had a great influence on Ahasuerus, the king, saved the Jewish people from destruction. And her relative Mordecai was second in command over the kingdom of Persia. In the book of Daniel, we see Daniel as a high advisor to King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. Jeremiah says to the people of Israel, seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, for in its welfare you will find your welfare or your well-being. So Jeremiah encouraged the exiles, the Jewish exiles, to seek the good of the political kingdom in which they were forcibly being held captive in exile. In the New Testament, we have John the Baptist, who rebuked Herod the king for all the evil deeds he had done. In Luke 3:23, it says. I believe it's Luke 3:23. And then we have Paul reasoning with the Roman governor Felix about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment. And the Greek text there uses the word dialegomai, which has to do with back and forth dialogue. And I think that means that Paul was, that Felix was saying to Paul, well, what about this policy? What about that policy that I enacted? And Paul was talking to him about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment. In other words, holding him accountable for his actions as a political leader. So the Old Testament and New Testament, there are more examples than those, but it seems clear that there's an approval of God's people influencing government for good. And I want to encourage Christians to do that today.
Well, that's an interesting segue into something else too, is we have scriptures as Christians that tell us to obey government, and we come up against this thing that is constantly used to bat Christians over the head, namely the separation of church and state. You know, in the early part of the church, we have, I think it was Tertullian who said, what hath Jerusalem to do with Athens? What hath the center of religion to do with the center of reason? And the history of Christian philosophical theology has been about how to integrate and play in that sphere. But this is another sphere, isn't it? Church and state. With that separation that we're often told that we're supposed to abide by, how are Christians not to obey that injunction? Aren't we supposed to listen to what they're saying? Separation of church and state. Doesn't this mean that Christians can't come out of the closet in the public square? How and why should Christians be publicly engaged if we're supposed to stay separate? How does that church and state thing work from a Christian perspective?
First thing I would say is ask someone where the phrase came from, separation of church and state. It is not in the Bible, and it is not in the United States Constitution. It's rather, it has a long history that I don't need to go into.
Okay.
But there is some sense in which there is a separation of church and state, in that Jesus said in the book of Matthew, when his Pharisees challenged him on whether it was right to pay taxes to Caesar, he said, show me a coin. And then he said, whose likeness and inscription is this on the coin? And they said, Caesar's. And Jesus said, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's, which implied that there were two realms of influence. There was a realm of influence that belonged to Caesar, and his inscription was on the coin. The implication is, yes, pay taxes. It's his government. But there's a realm of obedience to God, which is outside the realm that government has a right to control, and that's what gives the foundation for a sense of freedom of religion, where government shouldn't compel people in things that belong to God, the realm of religious practice. That should be, we should allow freedom. So there is a sense in which there's a distinction between the authority of the civil government and the authority of the church and the Christian leaders. Now that's a difference from the Old Testament, because in the Old Testament, the government of Israel and the government of the people of God in Israel was the same government. Moses was the head of both. David was the head of both. David was king of Israel and head over the people of Israel. But in the New Testament, we don't have the... when Paul writes to Timothy or to Titus in Ephesus or Crete and tells them to appoint elders, he doesn't say, go to your city council and the city council members are the elders of the church. There's no thought like that. It's there's a distinction. There are character qualifications for elders to be above reproach, husband of one wife, not violent, not a drunkard, etc. but no expectation that the civil government of the city will be involved in the government of the church. They're separate. But that doesn't mean they can't influence each other. And that's why I come back to, in my book, Politics According to the Bible, my argument is Christians should influence government for good. That doesn't mean control government. It means influence government. And those examples of God's people influencing secular governments, I think, give encouragement to that.
Right. Yeah, it seems to me that probably why the evil twins of religion and politics, as people often look at them, are so evil is because both of them happen to deal with ethics, and ethical concern is something everyone has, whether they've got an ethical system worked out or not. And so while you might have, it seems to me, different juridical powers or roles of church and state, religion and politics, I think about a statement. I don't even know if it actually was said by John Quincy Adams, but I like it so much because it's interesting. He said that, or allegedly said that, the highest glory of the American Revolution was this, that it connected in one indissoluble bond the principles of civil government and the principles of Christianity. And whether he said that or not, it's interesting, because I think that what we hear now, using it as a bat to keep Christians in the closet, as it were, is a revisionism of history. I mean, if most of the founding fathers were Christian, or at least they were theists or deists.
Yes, and they held to, by and large, to biblical moral values or ethical values.
Right. Then certainly,
worldview.
Yeah, they couldn't have intended Christians or the church as a whole to just stay in the closet and not be engaged in the public square. So that, it brings up a question that, some used to accuse Christians of this a lot, and sometimes they still do. And it's a question maybe some would wonder about you, because you've got such a big book on the Bible and politics. But legislating morality, Christians were often accused of that. Now it seems to be non-Christians doing it, and doing it with justification. But is legislating morality wrong?
It's hard to think of a law that doesn't have some moral convictions underlying it. Laws against murder are there because people agree that murder is morally wrong. Laws against stealing are there because people agree in a country, in a municipality, that stealing is wrong, morally wrong. Laws against violation of contract are there because people say that telling a lie in a business deal is wrong. There are laws against people having sex with minors are there because people think that's morally wrong. So the Bible does a couple of things, Corey. It has explicit teachings about the role of government and what government should do. In Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2, basically government is to restrain evil, punish evil, and promote good for the nation. The civil authority, as Paul says in Romans 13:4, is God's servant for your good. And when I get to talk to anybody involved in politics or government, I often will bring that up, saying, this verse looks at you, and say that to a United States congressman or to the prime minister of another country, which I've done in the past. I say, you are God's servant to do good for the nation. So there's restraining evil and promoting good laws for the nation, good policies. But that doesn't mean the government should own property that belongs to individuals. There are warnings, for instance, against the king who accumulates too much gold, or warnings. Samuel warns the people, if you get a king over you, he'll take and take and take. He'll take your men servants and your maid servants, or your children, to be his servants, and take the best of your fields and your crops, and you'll be his slaves. So there's a warning against government accumulating too much power over people, and I think that is something we should definitely be concerned about today. So the Bible teaches about what government should do, and that should inform Christians in their work as whether they just vote as responsible Christians, whether they run for city council or school board or run for state legislature or U.S. Congress or president. I think Christians should follow the calling of God on their lives, and some are called to be very involved in political issues, to influence government for good. What's wrong with that?
Right, right. And I think, in today's day, we talk a lot about racism, and sometimes this new critical race theory seems to a certain extent to be a repudiation of the 60s civil rights and Martin Luther King's take on certain notes about focusing on the content of one's character and not the color of one's skin. But I think King said something about this to the effect that I may not be able to legislate morality in the sense of making someone not hate me, but I can keep them from lynching me, and that's a good too.
Yes, exactly.
So
Yeah,
so
so there's limit to what government can do. Government can't compel feelings
right,
or attitudes or emotions,
right,
but it certainly can prevent people from doing harm to one another.
right. And the government comes along, or scripture comes along and talks about government, less so in the New Testament, I suppose, but it's God's minister for justice. But now we get to the question about how big of government. Do we go with big government or small government? Is the Old Testament or the New Testament the best guide for our time? I see a lot of people quoting for big government Old Testament passages, maybe the Sermon on the Mount at times. What do you think about that? Is the Old Testament is old mold? Is it not relevant anymore? Or how do we sort this out? Big government versus small government?
Well, there's a question of biblical interpretation, and that is we have to put in perspective the overall historical development of Scripture. And the nation of Israel was a theocracy. It was governed by God, and so you had laws concerning murder, adultery, stealing, false witness, but you also had laws concerning sacrifices and festivals and religious observances, clean and unclean foods and other things like that. But we're not the nation of Israel in the Old Testament, what is called the Old Covenant. That's abolished with the advent of the New Covenant with Christ's death and resurrection. So the Old Testament can give us examples of good and bad conduct by good and evil kings, and it can give us examples of good and bad conduct in the Psalms and Proverbs and the wisdom literature about good and evil rulers. But the Old Testament doesn't provide a pattern for us of what government should do in controlling all the details of people's lives. The thing about government, size of government, is people need to realize that the more power that government gets, the less freedom we have as individuals. And that's a major philosophical difference between the two parties. In shorthand, I would say that the Democrats contain many people who think they know better than we do how to run our lives. And they're willing to enact laws that encroach on individual freedoms to choose. But Republicans, by and large, tend to gravitate toward laws that allow more freedom and less government control of people's lives. And I think that the biblical theme of the importance of human responsibility for our own choices would favor increasing human freedom and restricting government to punishing evil deeds that things that harm people, like theft and murder and physical assault and things like that.
And it does seem like just looking at the historical pattern in recent times, one might argue that the Democrats have started to move more toward a bigger or biggest government, socialism. Yes. And the Republicans have moved into the seat of the Democrats into big government. And so the goalpost for the entire political two-party system has shifted
That
Poor
worries me.
big government.
Yeah, that concerns me. And a measure of that is the taxes. Because when the government takes away taxes from us, it takes away our freedom to decide how to use that money as we think best. And that's a major issue that people don't seem to be talking about. Higher taxes mean less freedom.
Yeah, and sometimes, the argument is made on moral grounds, appealing to sentiments or pity, that we need the money to help people, when we always know that politicians are predominantly struggling with corruption, wherever they're at. A human is a human is a human. But the question is what is the proper role of government? We see in the New Testament, Romans 13, a minister of justice, as you said. The church has largely been a minister of compassion, and it seems like once we acquiesce and maybe abdicate our role and responsibility in that area and give it over to government, then the church becomes somewhat irrelevant, and more people start to look to the hand of government to help them, don't they?
A highly placed official in the state of Arizona said to me once, Wayne, in the Phoenix area, if it weren't for the work of churches helping the poor, we could not keep up with the need that is there. He just said that to me privately in a conversation with the block party where we live. And the church, I think we have to realize, has throughout history helped the poor and the needy and should continue to do that. But when my wife volunteers to work at a food bank in downtown Phoenix, she's making a free choice to do that of her own will. And there's so much more value and reward and dignity in that, as opposed to me writing a check so the government can do it. That is, when people of their own free will work through a church, there's a personal involvement with caring for those who are less fortunate economically, and we should not lose that. Americans are by nature incredibly generous people, historically, and when government taxes more and more and more because they need to give more and more benefits to people who are needy and probably buying votes by doing that, or think they're doing that.
Certainly corruption.
There's a moral cost to it because it's impersonal.
Right, often impersonal and inefficient. An argument
Very
can be
inefficient.
made.
Yeah.
Another topic that you've written on, again, another tome. You're a busy writer. Biblical manhood. That term is interesting in itself, but more interesting in the last 18 months. It might well be considered as a patriarchal expression synonymous with the term toxic masculinity, often mentioned in our culture today. It comes out of academia once again and flushes through the system down to culture and then into politics. But toxic masculinity, the biblical manhood notion, seems to be, by the influence of critical theory, to be a patriarchal expression of oppression, don't you think?
I don't think anything that's biblical is toxic.
Okay.
It's false accusation. Biblical manhood is manhood according to the teachings of the Bible. And if we follow the teachings of the Bible, we do have the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church. There's a leadership role for husbands in marriage. It's not toxic, that's God ordained. It's healthy and it's right and makes for good marriages. And we have Paul saying in 1 Timothy 2 that he does not allow a woman to teach or have authority over a man. That's in the context of the assembled church. So churches that restrict the pastorate and the elder board to men are not being guilty of toxic masculinity. They're being they're following biblical faithfulness. And I don't think it's right to call that toxic. It's healthy.
Someone might point and say, look, even when we look at God and we call him he, we use these gender pronouns in a day of the gender blender, you might say.
Right.
I mean, is God really a he? Wasn't this just written by those in power who have privilege and want to sustain their power? I mean, is God really a he?
Well, the Bible repeatedly refers to God as father, not mother,
Uh-huh.
as king, not queen. And both the Hebrew text of the Bible and of the Old Testament and the Greek text of the New Testament use masculine pronouns, he, him, his, to refer to God. And so I think that's reflective of God's kingship or authority. There's a leadership role that belongs to men that is appropriate to manhood. And God is the archetype for that.
And you don't think that makes men better than women?
No, because the first chapter of the Bible says God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. That verse, Genesis 1, 26, 27, it indicates that we are both in the image of God, which is the highest status of any creature in the universe. And men and women share that status equally. So true biblical manhood respects and honors and values women as well as men, and doesn't give any credibility to the idea that men are better than women or women are better than men. We're both valuable, equally valuable.
Yeah, and I would encourage listeners to look at your books. You've also got one on biblical feminism, I think, right?
I got a couple.
Yeah, and a couple. We'll be having a future episode for listeners,
It's
actually
called,
from a woman on the topic of women in Christianity. But I would encourage listeners to go check out Dr. Grudem's books on this topic.
yeah, they both start with the word evangelical feminism. One is called Evangelical Feminism and Biblical Truth. That's biblical arguments back and forth.
Mm.
And the other one is called Evangelical Feminism, A New Path to Liberalism, which says that when churches capitulate to having women pastors and elders, it's a major step in the direction of liberalism, which in theology rejects the authority of the Bible as determinative for what we believe and do. And it's a slippery slope that is often leads churches away from obedience to Scripture in many other areas as well.
Certainly a controversial topic, but I think more and more the reigning paradigm is seeking to subvert the meta narrative. They say they don't like meta narratives. They certainly don't like the meta narrative of the Bible, which is the basis for much of what we find of goodness in Western civilization. A final question I might ask you is our ministry, Ratio Christi, which means the reason of Christ. We're on the campus. We know that politics is downstream from culture and culture is downstream from education. What role do you see for Christian mission to and into academia?
Well, first of all, Corey, acting as a friend and a conversational partner with Christians who are on college campuses and with those who are interested in Christianity and want to talk more about it. Because you and your staff bring a wealth of many years of experience and wisdom that undergraduates just don't have. I think back to my years as an undergraduate at Harvard, and I was helped tremendously by staff members from Campus Crusade for Christ, now called CRU, and from InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and to some extent from the Navigators. They had so much more background and knowledge and information than I did, and they were a great help. So that's first, the ministry and attention to individual students. Next, to what extent you can encourage students or faculty members to make their views known publicly. That's useful. There are often forums where we can do that. When I was a sophomore at Harvard, we had Francis Schaeffer come to campus, and he was a very effective apologist for the Christian faith. And we invited the presidents of every campus organization to meet with him for lunch at the Harvard Faculty Club. And that was a bold move on our part. I don't know if anyone became a Christian through it, but it put our Harvard Radcliffe Christian Fellowship on the visibility on the radar screen of many people on campus. So events like that, where outside speakers can be brought in. I remember another outside speaker, John Warwick Montgomery, speaking on the historic Christian faith. I remember J.N.D. Anderson speaking on the historicity of the resurrection. He was an accomplished professor from the United Kingdom and very funny and erudite. So these events where Christians are not afraid to uphold and defend the truths of Christianity in high-level academic settings, those can do a tremendous amount to encouraging Christians in their faith and bringing some people to faith and influencing the climate on campus. So I remember with some sadness an event that happened at Harvard between my junior and senior years. Near the end of my junior year, I was taking a history of music class from a professor named Woody Woodward. And he had seen my name connected with the Harvard Radcliffe Christian Fellowship with some event that was in the newspaper, the Harvard Crimson. And he recognized that I was in his lecture class, large lecture class. And he asked if he could meet with me. He had lunch and asked me, do you really believe the Bible? Do you believe all these things to be true? And I said yes, but I didn't push him on it. I was intimidated by him as a full professor. And, but I think he was wanting to believe. I look back on it, I think he had come from a Christian background and was wanting to be reassured. I don't think I did a very good job. And then in the fall, I came back as my senior year, and the headline on the newspaper was Professor Woodward drops dead of heart attack.
If you don't know where you're going when you die, it's not safe to die.
Yeah, I don't know. I hope I'll see him in heaven, but I missed an opportunity. And I felt bad about that. Christians
need to be an influence in their sphere.
And God gives us opportunities. There's another opportunity I had. One of the students who sat alone at a table with his personal valet or assistant in the same dining hall as I ate every day and in the same corridor on the dormitory was the Crown Prince of Nepal, who went home and became King of Nepal. I talked to him 3 or 4 times, but I could have talked to him many other times. He was sitting by himself many times. And if I had befriended him, I could have probably had opportunity for Christian witness. He went back and became king. And after he'd been king for a few years, one of the cousins came in with a machine gun and murdered the whole royal family.
Wow. Yeah, it's a real opportunity to influence not only people made in God's image toward God, but even leaders and movement leaders near where I'm at, near Purdue University.
Yeah.
When the Arab Spring began several years back, and a lot of the governments that were being toppled, Egypt was the first one where Mubarak was toppled. The person who became the interim prime minister happened to do his master's and PhD at Purdue. Once again, opportunity. And when you speak of Harvard, wow, the first college in the nation, I've been there, you attended there. Their motto for 300 years was truth for Christ and the church. And now in the Harvard Crimson, they've announced that for the first time ever, starting last year, there are more atheists and agnostics in the student body than there are Protestants and Catholics for the first time ever.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
So, yeah. Well,
but I guess the reason I tell those stories is I think Christian students need to realize that their faith has depth and academic credibility.
absolutely.
The highest levels of academic research, there are Christian answers and Christian approaches. The students need not be afraid that they'll be talked out of their Christian faith by a conversation with a non-believer. The non-believer doesn't know nearly as much about the world as the Christian does. And the Bible tells us truth about the world that non-Christians don't have any access to. So we have the truth, and we can be a bit more bold, I think, in defending it and engaging politely in conversation with others about it.
Mm. Right. The book that changed the world, about the man that changed the world.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Grudem, I have appreciated this time we've spent together. Thanks for taking time out to discuss with us thoughtful Christianity as it relates to faith and politics. Thanks for your time. Thanks for all of your work.
Thank you, Corey. Good to be with you.